Unscripted Her fam. We are here to bring you a very... We're going to get into that.
Very interesting
Yo,
show.
but wait, come on.
Guys, come on, let's keep going. A very interesting show. Do you all know what June is?
Okay, we're
It's
going to
Pride Month.
We're going to stop.
No, we can do
can't
it.
just
We can't do it like this.
You can't.
No.
No, we're good. We were good. Okay,
Come
ready?
on,
Everybody deep breath.
It's only the 5th take.
Yes.
Really. I'm good.
All right. Hi, Unscripted Her fam. We are here to bring you a very special episode. It is June, which means it's
Pride Month.
Woo!
Go Pride. Like call it Human Month too. Pride Month come through.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. So don't think we forgot, because it's the end of the month. We wanted to go out with a bang, and we've got some exciting information to share with you all, and excited to have this discussion. So, Linda, if you could kick it off for
Gladly,
us.
I will. Thank you. Today is June 28th, 2020. We're actually recording this on a very special date in the history of the development of equal rights for the LGBTQ community. June 28th, 2020 is actually the 21st anniversary, the 51st anniversary of what is commonly called the Stonewall Inn Uprising. Sometimes it's called protests, sometimes it's called riots, but I prefer the terminology uprising, because to me that is in effect what it was. It was a night on June 28th in Greenwich Village, New York, at a location known as the Stonewall Inn, when the LGBTQ plus community said no to harassment. They said no to unfair arrest.
Wow.
They said no to unequal treatment. They said no to being locked up for simply being who they were.
Oh,
For
no.
not
bothering
hurting
anyone.
for not
No.
causing any distress
Not
to
taking,
anyone
not
else.
stealing, not hurting,
No,
just for
that-
being human.
Amen.
Right.
Specifically,
Representing adults. Human.
the Stonewall Inn was actually a restaurant. It was a bar, a lounge that's still there, sits in Greenwich Village today. So if you ever have
New
an
York.
opportunity
New York.
to go to New York and you want to see some of the sights other than perhaps the Statue of Liberty or Wall Street, you might make your way over to Greenwich Village and visit the historic Stonewall Inn, which is a locale where people were just gathered, having a good time, dancing, perhaps drinking, but not engaged in any activity that would have been considered illegal anywhere else, except for the fact that it may have been two men dancing with one another, or
So no
perhaps two
period
women
activity was
sitting
taking
and
place.
having a drink with one another. No what now?
Prurient activity.
No prurient activity,
They're
okay?
attorneys.
Yes, they are.
Wait,
Parent, what does it mean?
That
Wasn't
one went
it-
over my head,
Yeah.
so I'm
Were
going
the
to
non-lawyers in the room?
Immoral.
Immoral.
For lack of a better
And you
word.
said
Activity.
parent, right? Parent?
I might not be pronouncing.
I want to make sure I,
I think
use
it's
it properly.
prurient. Prurient.
Prurient.
Yes.
Okay.
Like the Puritanian.
Oh, pure.
Prurient.
Puritanian.
Yeah,
Purient.
root word.
Root
I
word.
think
Root
so.
We're
word.
gonna have to work on that. We'll come back to that.
Prurient.
Yeah.
We'll circle back around to that, because really want to just try and stay focused if we can on what was happening at the time in the 60s and in the LGBTQ community, and how persons were being treated simply again because of who they loved, not even who they chose to love, because it wasn't necessarily a choice, it was who they were. And I also wanted, I think this is maybe important for our community as well, to be aware of the role that not just women and not just black women, but black trans women played in this movement. Marsha P. Johnson,
Yeah.
is a black woman, trans woman, who actually was
Marsha P.
one of the
Johnson.
leaders, one of the instigators of the movement. And another is Sylvia Rivera, a close friend of Miss Johnson's,
Yes.
who was another leader in the movement.
Yeah.
And so, or the uprising at that time, Stonewall Inn Uprising. And what this uprising, I think, also did was to kick off a movement that is still seeing progress to this day. Because just a couple of weeks ago, we had a recent Supreme Court decision, a 6-3 decision. I'm going to bring in the law because we are lawyers. The 6-3 decision did rule that the 1964 Civil Rights Act, guess what? Where they say there's no discrimination in the workplace based on race or religion, and yes, sex, that does apply to persons who are discriminated because of perhaps a man's married to another man, or a woman is dating another woman, or perhaps you were born male but had a transgendered sex reassignment surgery, and now you cannot be fired because you're now a woman.
Right.
So just
So-
being fired for just who you are.
Right.
Again, just
And
who
Being
you
fired for just being you.
We see why it's such a big deal, but why is it coming up right now? Why with this administration? How did it even get to the Supreme Court?
are. Oh, this most recent case,
Yes.
it had been working its way to the Supreme Court, probably not predating the administration, but we are still working on applying rights equally to all citizens of the country.
Right.
There's still going to be more firsts, and this was one of them. I mean, it may come as a surprise to some people to know that your gay coworker could have been fired before the Supreme Court decision came about, simply for being your gay coworker,
Just for being
not
gay.
for anything they did on the job, not
Right.
for performance, none of that. Simply for being a gay coworker. So, for example, one of the plaintiffs in the case that the Supreme Court ruled in most recently, he was fired, even though he had an excellent performance record. He was fired because he joined a gay softball team.
Yeah.
And that was all it took. So he then turned around and sued,
Uh-huh.
and the case worked its way up to the Supreme Court and this most recent decision.
And I appreciate that, because that was very, very helpful, Linda. But I also wanted you to mention that it is a big deal because this current administration tried to overturn it.
So what can we do? We always hear vote, vote, vote.
Yes, you will hear
But-
that from me. I'm old school, so you're
I
gonna hear vote,
understand
vote,
that.
vote.
Local.
But what I voted and my
Yes.
candidate didn't win. Now what do I do? There's got to be more that we can do besides vote.
Well, there is more. There's there's levels to this involvement game. You can be involved financially. Let's say your candidate did not win, so then you turn around and you promote or invest monies in other candidates who might still be viable and might have an opportunity to prevail in their races. And it doesn't even have to be in your specific community. Let's keep in mind that this country, that what happens in one state can affect what's going to happen in another state. This brings me back around to another milestone in the LGBTQ movement. For example, DOMA, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, that was actually passed under Bill Clinton. There were times when Bill Clinton disappointed the LGBTQ community. So DOMA was passed, and that basically just said, you can go ahead and marry, because you had certain states that were allowing and recognizing gay marriage. And DOMA basically said, go ahead and get married in your state if you want to, but when it comes to having the right to have certain federal protections, you're not going to have those. So-
And benefits, like
And
if you
benefits,
wanted
yes.
to file as a married couple,
Yes.
you couldn't do that.
You could not do that even though you were legally married in your state. But because we filed federally as well as state, you could not file a federal income tax return and claim your spouse as your spouse.
Right.
So
and
what-
filing jointly.
Well, also, just a quick second, if you wanted to visit a hospital
Yes.
and the hospital had a policy that
Only
only quote,
spouses.
family members or
Mhm.
spouses could attend, you could be kept out. You could be kept out of the decision making for a
Absolutely.
loved one at the end of life. You didn't even have to be informed. Imagine if your husband or wife is terminally ill and you don't even have to be told what their medical treatment is or be informed about it. It's unconscionable.
Now, to be clear with that, Donelda, so, because that's on the federal level, but what if the state, you happen to be in a decent state, and the state was like, well, no, if they're partners and they're married, we will recognize
Individual
them.
states
So
were
it's
doing that.
individual.
Set up a
Individual states
patchwork
It did
kind
say
of
exactly.
system. So
Okay.
if I'm sick and dying, do I rush over to New York so that my spouse can be involved in my treatment,
I see.
or do I
Uproot
stay
my
here
s-
in where I am now?
Right,
I
I
mean,
see.
it's set up, and there are people who had to make those horrendous, hideous choices.
Yes.
And so the thing about DOMA, which was passed in '96 under Clinton, it was repealed by a Supreme Court. Again, it matters who is on the Supreme Court.
Because
it
not
was
to cut you
repealed
off.
in 2013, I believe it was 2013, by the decision of, it was Edie, her name is Edie Windsor. She brought that case and took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And very briefly, the facts of that case are just as Donelda described. these two lifelong partners, they were partners for 20 plus years, went to Canada where it was legal to marry because countries were passing marriage equality long before the United States got on board. Canada had passed marriage equality. These women were married in Canada. They lived in New York. They returned to their home state of New York. One does die from a long-term or a terminal illness, and she leaves a substantial estate to her wife, Edie Windsor. Miss Windsor tries to inherit that estate through as a spouse, which would normally be there'd be no taxes, there'd be no inheritance taxes if you inherited it from your spouse, or at least they would be less. I'm not a tax attorney, but I know that there is a benefit. But because her New York marriage was not recognized under federal, or rather her Canada marriage was not recognized under federal law or New York law, perhaps at that point, she was penalized almost $400,000 in taxes. And she took that to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't, that's not fair.
Right.
Yeah.
And they ultimately said that we will overturn the so-called Defense of Marriage Act.
That's the thing. So many of these, all of these cases have human beings behind them.
They do.
And the other thing too, you were talking about how do you get involved, but there are advocacy methods that you can be involved with. And for example, these cases, it's fascinating. These are strategies thought out by law students contribute, lawyers, they spend years and years. What court do we file in first? Then where do we go? What case do we select?
So we have about a minute
Right.
and a half left.
Oh,
So
I'm surprised.
I would say join one of the advocacy groups. There's a ton of them. We can put
Yes.
them on our website.
yeah, and one other thing that we have to touch
Or
on
donate
before
to
we
them.
go is we have to do this. We have to touch on faith really quickly. We're all Christians here.
Yes,
And we're all doing a show on Pride, and we're doing
Yes.
a show about equal rights. I think we need to deal with that with our family, particularly even in our culture. Okay.
You know, I think that's a good point because, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there's some very legalistic interpretations of Christianity that take into consideration,
quick for our
that
viewers.
come up with a
Yeah.
definition of, for example, only men can have a role in the church of leadership. God outlaws being gay or something like that. But if you take the Bible literally without context, God said, Jesus says, bring all men unto me. So that would mean literally only men are entitled to coming to Jesus. But we know that's nonsense. Jesus and God are love. They're love incarnate. That is the definition. God does not condition, I love you if you have gray eyes, I love you.
There's no qualifications.
There is no conditioning
no
on
conditioning
God's
and
love.
qualifications for God's love.
And it is really, really dangerously harmful for children who are growing up and begin to understand that they may not fit the defined norm that they're being told is the appropriate way to be told they're not loved by God. I just can't imagine anyone telling a child that.
So we're going to each end on one thing. So that was Donelda.
one thing?
That was what you wanted to end on to close
Yes.
this out? Yes. And Linda, what was the one thing you wanted to say? We keep
Well,
it
I
brief.
would say that LGBTQ plus rights are human rights, and they are also civil rights. And it took me a while to even come to that realization on my own, because I didn't know that I wanted to equate the gay rights movement with the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matters, etc. These movements that promoted equality based on race. But equality is equality, and it should not simply apply to those of a certain so-called sexual orientation or gender identity. Equality
Right.
And there were
is
certainly
equality.
gay people in the
And-
civil rights movement.
Oh, there absolutely
Which-
were. And we'll discuss
absolutely.
it. And we'll
Right.
discuss, even
And
though
what
this
was-
is June 28th and it's Pride Month and it's winding up. The Pride celebrations, especially in the Black community, go on throughout into the fall, and they go on throughout the summer. So we will be revisiting this topic again. We
Yeah.
couldn't fit it all in on this one show, but we're going to come back to it.
Yeah. What did you want to leave
Definitely.
us with, Ellen?
I think it's all been said. So
Okay.
I just want to thank you all.
wanted to
You have a couple words.
Yeah,
Let's get it
I
in.
wanted to.
Okay.
Just there were just two things. When Linda had mentioned, and we always talk about voting, it matters. Supreme Court. I don't know if you guys know this, but when you're voting the Supreme Court, that's for life. So Kavanaugh is there for life.
Yes.
I don't know if people knew that because I learned that about 6 years ago. I'm ashamed to say, but I
Don't
did.
be
That's
ashamed.
number one. And number two is, to Ellen's point, if the person you elected didn't get voted, don't give up. Go to the grassroots. Get involved on a very small local level. You can even have something at your house. You can even do what we're doing. You don't have to televise it, but a group of you can get together and talk about the things that are going on in your community.
Educate your
And
neighbors.
then, exactly,
Yeah,
educate your
friends.
neighbor.
Let
Each
them
one
And
know.
then they
one.
can
That's
educate
right.
you.
That's
That's
this is
right.
a love-friendly zone.
And that's
Come on
how we'll
over.
end
And
it.
that- yes.
So thank you for joining us on Unscripted.
Her.